In 1985, 25-year-old Joe Simpson and his 21-year-old climbing partner Simon Yates would be the first to ascend the west face of the Siula Grande mountain in the Peruvian Alps. But this achievement did not come without a great physical and emotional cost to the two men. While hearing this story, it's hard not to put yourself in the shoes of these men and think about what it is you would do if you were in their situation. Though Simon and Joe were in their early to mid-20s, the two had plenty of experience climbing through the Alps. One thing that motivated them was being the first to climb a mountain or climb through new routes of it. It was the unknown that really excited the two, and it was all the more fun with the challenge of succeeding where others failed. Chasing this excitement is what would lead them on a 2-day walk toward the Siula Grande. With them, they would bring a third person, a man by the name of Richard, who they had met along their travels and had taken enough of a liking to that they invited him to come along with them for the journey. Richard, who didn't really know anything about mountaineering, was really just along for the ride and would stay at base camp while Joe and Simon attempted their climb. The pair would attempt to reach the summit of the mountain using an alpine style of climbing. Alpine-style climbing is a self-sufficient approach, which means they plan to carry all of their food and supplies during their climb and would go without fixed rope lines, local guides, or preset camps on their routes where they could restock. It also meant they wouldn't use oxygen, which is incredibly helpful in high-altitude environments where the air pressure is low, making it harder to breathe. This was a full commitment climb, with little room to make any errors because the risks were so much greater. In the face of these challenges, the first day would go off without a hitch. The two would pass through the glacier after navigating its many crevices and begin their ascent. When night approached, the pair would create a cave by digging into the snow on the side of the mountain and rest. On day 2, they would make it about 20,000 feet without issue before they started encountering unexpected problems. While climbing the mountain with the wind and snow lashing at their faces, they would start to struggle with unstable powder snow on the last section of the face of the mountain. This setback slowed down the ascent, resulting in the two only climbing 200 feet in close to 6 hours. As the sun began to set and the cold became too much to bear, Simon and Joe, both exhausted, would dig another snow cave and settle in for the night. In the morning, now with full visibility, the two would realize the extent of their problem. The path they had been trying to climb was full of steep slopes covered in powdered snow and snow formations called flutings, which are notoriously difficult to climb. This is where the first inklings of concern started to form, and the two began to worry they would climb themselves into a position they couldn't get out of. Despite their worries, by 2 p.m. Simon and Joe managed to get to the north ridge of the mountain and climb the summit. They would only take a moment to celebrate their achievement, understanding they now faced the most dangerous part of the climb, the descent back down. Due to the obstacles that delayed their ascent, Joe and Simon recognized the food supplies and fuel they used to melt snow for drinking water were dwindling. Though this was a concern, Joe and Simon had pre-planned their path through the north ridge of the mountain where they would then abseil to a smaller section of the face and, in theory, could walk the rest of the way. But not long after attempting to climb down the north ridge, they began to realize it was not going to be as straightforward as they had hoped. To their west, the mountain was vertical, and to the east, there were more of the dangerous flutings they had encountered on their ascent. What made things even worse is after only half an hour into their climb back down, they would encounter a snowstorm and become lost in the blinding white snow. When the clouds eventually broke and they could see again, Simon, who was in front, spotted the ridge they had planned to follow. As he began walking over the top of it, suddenly the ice and snow below him gave way. Without realizing it, Simon had walked over a ledge of overhanging snow. His rope tightened, saving him from the fall and allowing him to climb back up. Though Simon was safe, these difficulties would eat away at daylight, and their plan of descending the mountain in a single day would fail. Despite their best effort, Joe and Simon were still at 20,000 feet and now needed to camp for an additional night on fleeting supplies. To make matters even worse, while boiling water for the next day, their stove would run out of gas. On their 4th day atop the mountain, the two remained optimistic the worst of the climb was over, and by the end of the day, they would be at base camp. But it wasn't long until they encountered another problem, one that would strike away at their optimism and turn the climb into a life-or-death situation. Joe, who was leading the two, would find a vertical drop dividing the top of the ridge and their path. Intending to climb down, he would get on his hands and knees before hammering his axes on the top of the ridge and lowering himself. While hanging by both axes, he would take one out and hammer it into the ice on the vertical wall. Now with one arm clutched to the axe above the ridge and the other directly opposite of his shoulder, he would realize the axe he had hammered into the side of the wall wasn't stable. Still hanging to the ridge with one axe, he would pull the other from the side of the wall and swing it into the ice again. When his axe struck the wall, it would cause the snow around him to collapse and he would fall from his position and onto his leg before sliding down the slope. Unbearable pain shot down his thigh and into his knee, but what was worse than the pain was the fear of breaking his leg still so high up on the mountain. With shaking hands, Joe reached down and felt for a bone sticking out of his leg or a sign of blood, and to his surprise found neither. Hopeful he'd only torn a ligament, Joe then attempted to stand on his injured leg. This would result in another jolt of sharp and violent pain, and he would feel the bones inside his leg rub against each other as he collapsed under his own weight. Unknown to him at the time, the impact of the fall had driven his lower leg bone straight through his knee joint. Simon, who had run to help Joe, would look down at him from the top of the ridge. What Simon would find is a terrified and desperate Joe looking back at him, and a feeling of doom washes over both of them. After giving Joe painkillers, the pair would just sit in silence for a moment. Both were aware Joe's injury was virtually a death sentence, and if Simon wanted any chance of surviving, he would have to leave his friend to die. Simon would quietly contemplate the ultimatum before calming himself and making the decision to save his friend. Knowing they had to get back to base camp as quickly as possible, Simon and Joe would tie 250-foot ropes together, creating a 300-foot rope that Simon can use to lower Joe down the mountain. With the rope sorted, Simon then digs a seat into the snow, allowing him to bear Joe's weight, and begins the process of lowering down Joe at 300-foot intervals. However, one of the complications with this plan was the knot that they had used to connect the two ropes. It was too large to fit through the metal clips attached to the rope that acted as a brake. In order to get the knot through, at each 150-foot interval, Joe would need to stand on his good leg and steady himself to give Simon time to undo the clip and then reclip it on the other side of the knot. Once this was done, Simon would continue lowering Joe, and then at the 300-foot mark, climb down to meet up with him to continue the process. This was no easy task, and what made it even worse was that each time Simon lowered Joe, he would scream in agony as his injured leg slid and smashed against the mountain. To add more urgency, a storm had struck, whipping the pair with sub-zero winds and snow, which only aided in crumbling the seats they had dug into the snow to help Simon remain stable. If this wasn't enough, Simon's hands were frozen and he was handling a rope the size of a pinky finger, whilst Joe had lost 1.5 pints of blood and was entering shock. If it weren't for the storm, they could consider stopping, but with it in full effect, any cave they dug could collapse and bury them alive in the snow. But despite how bad things seemed, Simon would start to believe they were close to hitting the bottom and quicken his pace. However, unknown to Simon, Joe, who was 100 feet away, would start to feel the slope become steeper and the snow turn to rough ice. In a panic, Joe would try to scream for Simon to stop, but his screams were drowned out by the howling of the wind and the sheer distance between the two. Unable to really see, it would be the feeling of weightlessness that would validate Joe's fears as he tumbled off the edge of the mountain and into a free fall below. Fortunately, the rope connected to him would stop him from falling to his death, but he was now just hanging off the side of this cliff. Looking down, Joe's chest tightens. Below was an 80-foot crevasse with nothing to catch his fall but ice and rock. Simon notices the rope tighten and become heavier, but believes Joe has just gone over steeper ground and is completely oblivious to the situation at hand. Joe wildly swings his axe in an attempt to hammer it into the wall beside him, but he's unable to reach it, and Simon continues lowering the rope. This amplifies Joe's terror because he knows there's not enough rope for him to get to the bottom of the crevasse, and if Simon uses all the rope without Joe having a stable place to take his weight off it, Simon would have no way of disconnecting it. If Simon couldn't disconnect the rope, then the two would be stuck in their positions, unable to move, and Simon would have no idea what had happened. There's nothing Joe can do but scream as he drops further and further down. Suddenly, the rope stops moving, and Joe's heart drops when he feels Simon tug on the rope. A signal he had been using to tell Joe to take his weight off the rope so he could thread the knot through the clip and continue lowering him. But of course, the rope remains strained under Joe's weight. He has nowhere to go, and he can no longer reach the side of the cliff. Realizing his only chance to get them out of this situation is to climb back up the rope and onto the cliff's edge, Joe uses 2 thinner cords of rope he has on him to create 2 loops. His plan is to tie the loops to the rope he's attached to. With the first loop, he can pull himself up to the point where he can get his foot through it and then use it as a foothold. With his foot secured, he could then slide the second loop above him and pull himself upwards, allowing him to climb back to safety. But it was incredibly difficult to handle these small pieces of rope after days of being out in the mountain. His hands were completely frozen and now without any feeling in them. He was trying to hold himself up with one arm and tie a knot with the other. With great difficulty, Joe managed to secure the first loop, attach it to his chest and reach for the second. But while attempting to secure the second, it would slip out of his hands and disappear below him. Now without the second loop, he had no way of climbing back up, and now all he could do was come to terms with the fact that at some point that night, he would fall into the crevice and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As Joe wrestled with this helplessness, Simon, still 150 feet above Joe, stood still in the freezing winds, anchored in his crumbling position for over an hour with no idea of what had happened to Joe, and no way to descend without the weight being released from the bottom of the rope. Joe hung over the crevasse for that hour, just waiting with the expectation Simon would eventually be pulled off the slope and they would both die. Simon also understood this, and in a state of pure desperation, he would pull off his rucksack and dig around inside it with one hand until he found what he was looking for. With a small knife in hand, Simon began to cut the rope connecting him to Joe. When the rope snapped, Simon fell back into the snow, and Joe fell 150 feet into the dark crevasse below him. Now free of the weight, severely dehydrated and exhausted, Simon dug out a snow cave and rested for the night with the thought of what he had just done to his friend weighing on his mind. But as Simon rested, Joe woke up to find himself on a sloping ledge in the crevasse and turned his head torch on. Surprised he had survived the fall, Joe looked down only to discover his torch's light didn't even scratch the surface of how deep the hole below him was. Scanning the area, he would realize just how lucky his fall had been. If he had landed 2 or 3 feet to the right, he would have been swallowed by the darkness and killed from the fall. Peering above, he noticed the rope which had connected him to Simon scaled roughly 80 feet above and led to the opening in the crevasse. Thinking his friend had surely fallen and died somewhere above him, Joe pulled on the rope, believing it would eventually tighten because Simon's dead body would act as a counterweight. Joe continued pulling the rope toward him, sure at some point it would tighten. But despite how much rope he pulled, it refused to, and soon the end of the rope would fall by his feet. When he picked it up and looked at it, he immediately understood what had happened. Simon was not on the other side of the rope, because he had cut it to save himself. And Joe once again struggled with the thought he was truly going to die. What was worse to consider was how he would die now. Though injured, it wasn't something that would kill him quickly. So how long would it take if he sat on this ledge for him to succumb to dehydration or the freezing cold? Despite the rope being cut, and the understanding that came with it, Joe could only take pleasure in the idea that at least his friend would make it out. To save what was left of the battery in his head torch, Joe just turned it off and lay in the darkness. With only the whistling of the wind above him and the chill in the air, Joe was enveloped in dread. He was only 25, he had so many ambitions and mountains he planned to climb, and now he was faced with a prolonged death only made worse by the piercing and empty loneliness he felt. At first light the next morning, now day 5 on the mountain, Simon awoke, got dressed in his ice cave and began his lone descent. As he lowered himself down, he would come to the point where he knew Joe had been hanging and was confronted by the bottomless crevasse below. Knowing that Simon would be up at first light and possibly looking for water, Joe waited for the sun to rise and continued to scream for Simon, hoping he would hear his cries and help him get out. Simon did call out for Joe from a distance, but the thought that Joe could have lived through the fall wasn't something he seriously considered, and the drive to survive himself would see Simon pass the crevasse without looking inside. By 10 AM, after hours of shouting Simon's name, Joe accepted he was definitely on his own. While all of this was happening, Richard, the man Simon and Joe had met and brought with them to stay at the base camp, came to the conclusion both of the men had died. Having just met the men and not knowing anything about them except their first names, Richard felt as though he couldn't just leave. With no knowledge of mountaineering or climbing, Richard reasoned that if they died, their bodies would just fall to the bottom of the mountain, and his best bet was to walk the surrounding glaciers and attempt to spot their bodies. Unbeknownst to Richard, Simon had just climbed down and was following the tracks left from the ascent to make it back to camp. As Simon got closer to the camp, Joe was making the decision to climb down the crevasse, hoping he could find a way out at the bottom. Slowly, he lowered himself down, with no idea of what he would find below him. Joe wouldn't even bother knotting the rope above him, figuring if there was nothing to be found below, he would just fall and end his life there. While Joe was making his last effort to escape the crevasse, Simon staggered along the tracks, thinking about what it was he was going to tell Joe's family. The guilt of the situation led him to consider lying about what he had done, knowing though it was necessary, it wouldn't be perceived well. With these swirling thoughts and emotions, he would spot Richard patrolling the base of the mountain. Richard rushed towards Simon asking if he was okay, and then following up with a question Simon dreaded having to answer. "Where's Joe?" On the way back to camp, Simon would tell Richard the truth about what had happened on the mountain. Neither of them had any idea Joe was now climbing 80 feet down into the crevasse. Spotting snow on the floor of the crevasse, Joe took it as a sign he was at the bottom, but 50 feet away he would spot something that filled him with more hope than he had ever felt during his time on the mountain. A ray of sunlight shone through a hole in the crevasse with a slope that led right to the opening. On his stomach, Joe would climb up the slope, but soon he would hear the sound of something tumbling beneath him. This sound would reveal to him that what he was climbing on wasn't solid. It was akin to climbing on something as fragile as eggshells. One wrong move and the entire thing could break away and take him with it. With no other option, Joe continued on, each movement causing him to put weight on his broken leg. The pain and feeling of the bone moving inside his leg caused him to almost faint, but after an agonizing climb, Joe managed to pull himself out on the other side. The sun he had followed now shining down on him. His relief, however, would be short-lived as he looked out and saw the miles of glacier he would have to navigate across to safety. Without food or water, the thought of just laying there weighed on his mind. Knowing he had come this far, Joe pushed himself, setting checkpoints on certain landmarks and timing himself to get there. In a sitting position, Joe would use his arms and good leg to push himself across the snow. What motivated him even further was the sight of Simon's tracks across the glacier. Joe figured if he didn't see Simon's body, this would indicate a safe path through the glacier and back to the base camp. But the process of pushing himself was slow, and the day turned to night, bringing wind and snow which began to fill his guide to safety. Desperate, Joe continued to crawl right through the night, terrified he would lose Simon's tracks. Eventually succumbing to exhaustion, Joe would wake in the morning of day 6 to find his lifeline erased from the surface of the mountain. While Joe continued onwards, Simon and Richard, still under the belief Joe was dead, stayed at camp. Despite Richard urging Simon to leave the camp and seek medical help, Simon, who was physically exhausted but still wrestling with the guilt of what had taken place, declined, not ready to leave and deal with what was to come once they left. Joe, on the other hand, had just finished crawling through the glacier and was now faced with yet another problem. The rocks and boulders surrounding the bottom of the mountain made it almost impossible to crawl the rest of the way. Joe would decide he needed to stand and hop the rest of the way if he was to make it out alive. Using the same landmark and time-based checkpoints as he had when he was crawling, Joe stumbled over rocks, falling on his broken leg with almost every movement. Another night would pass, Joe still climbing through the rocks, now losing his mental functions and entering delirium. At points he would pass out and wake up under the belief he was still on the mountain. It was only when a strong smell would cut through the delirium that Joe would realize he had made it to the base camp latrine. Overcome with excitement, Joe would scream Simon's name, praying they hadn't left him behind. When he received no reply, nor heard the sound of rushed footsteps approaching, the feeling of abandonment became all too much. Joe continued to scream out Simon's name, unable to believe he would just die at an abandoned base camp after everything he had gone through to get there. These screams would rustle Richard out of his sleep, and for a moment he wasn't sure what he had heard until Joe screamed a second time. At first, Richard lay there, spooked, wondering if it really was Joe or something more nefarious after hearing what had happened and the time that had passed. Simon, however, who woke to his name echoing across the mountain and the valley, burst out of his tent and started searching the dark plains. 200 meters away, they found Joe, nearing death, now having lost a third of his body weight. After all he had been through, Joe was finally safe. In the first exchange between Simon and Joe after the incident, Joe would thank Simon for attempting to save him and tell him he would have done the same thing had he been in Simon's position. Regardless of Joe's understanding, when Simon finally returned to England and word of their story had spread, he would be subject to intense criticism and battle with the guilt of his decision for a lifetime.